Thank you, Ian. So today I'll like to present to you about how we can harness the superpowers of coastal wetlands to improve water quality and boost the resilience of our reef. And in the spirit of the symposium, I'd like to say a few words about myself. So I grew up in a landlocked city in Munich, Germany, and I spent a lot of time in my childhood hiking in the mountains and skiing in the winter or snowboarding. And it was only in my undergraduate studies that I discovered marine biology and I started diving. And since then, I've been able to visit and also see the multiple threats to coral reefs in the Red Sea, in the Aldabra Atoll in the Indian Ocean, in the Galapagos Islands, and of course the Great Barrier Reef, and also the Australian Coral Sea. And this has inspired me to work towards protecting these coral reefs. First of all, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to Australia's First Nations peoples. I usually work, live, and meet on Gubbi Gubbi country on the Sunshine Coast, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. Something I would like to highlight, and it's also important to the rest of my talk, is that First Nations peoples in Australia, but also around the world, have recognized or have long recognized this deep connection between land and sea. For those who don't know the Australian Marine Conservation Society, we have been around for a while, so we consider ourselves the voice for Australia's ocean. We are comprised of marine scientists and conservationists who advocate for evidence-based solutions to tackle the biggest threats to Australia's oceans. And well, we have defended Australia's oceans since more than 59 years, so since '65. And in the mid-'60s, we defeated an application to mine corals from the Great Barrier Reef. And since then, our work has been important to in the formation of the marine park in '75, and also its listing as a World Heritage Area in '81. And since then, we've been working to protect the outstanding universal values of the reef. And most recently, we have accomplished the phase-out of gill nets from the GBR. Wetlands in the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area connect the land to the sea. And these are wetlands are ecosystems that are marine, brackish, or freshwater, and they're permanently or periodically or occasionally inundated, and they comprise things such as wetlands, seagrass meadows, salt marshes, freshwater swamps, and also rivers. Wetlands in the GBR, well, of course, the superstars of this conference are corals, but I want to put wetlands a bit into perspective with a few facts. And wetlands include both coastal ecosystems, but also ecosystems on the floor of the Great Barrier Reef lagoons, such as seagrasses. And together they comprise an area of 61% of the World Heritage Area. And particularly seagrasses are very abundant in the GBR, so it has been recognized as a global hotspot with 15 species that cover over 35,000 square kilometers, which is actually an area that is similar or comparable to what is covered by corals. And in this image here, you can see a distribution of seagrasses. This is not corals, and you can kind of see how it resembles the shape of the reef too. And of course, these seagrasses, for example, are important habitats for dugongs, sea turtles, many marine fish species, and invertebrates. Now, when I talk about the superpowers of coastal wetlands, I'm referring to the many values they provide to humans and nature. And wetlands have been or have been central to the cultural identity of First Nations peoples. They are also very good at maintaining biodiversity and ecological connectivity. They protect our coastlines from extreme weather events such as floods, cyclones, and strong wave action. They're also really good carbon sinks, so they act as buffer against climate change. And wetlands are really good water filters. So, for example, they reduce the runoff of sediments by stabilizing riverbanks and slowing down the flow of the water. And they're really good in removing nitrogen from the water through a process called denitrification. And of course, they have many commercial, recreational, and cultural values for all coastal communities. Now, the threats to the reef and coastal wetlands are both global and local. And wetlands have reduced by 50% since European settlement in the Great Barrier Reef. Fortunately, this has stopped in the last decade due to coastal wetland protection. But today, still the biggest threat to coastal wetlands and the reef is global climate change caused by greenhouse gas emissions, which increases the frequency of extreme weather events. On a local scale, poor water quality, mainly resulting from runoff from the agriculture, remains the biggest threat to coastal ecosystems and mid and inshore coral reefs and seagrass meadows. Now, we of course have seen many images of bleached corals recently, but I promise I'll put a positive spin on this story towards the end of my presentation. Here are some photos that I took on Magnetic Island, so an inshore reef in Arthur Bay on Magnetic Island of Townsville. And this was after a period of heavy rainfall. And there was a very thick, murky freshwater layer in the bay, and many of the corals in the bay had bleached. So it's particularly those inshore and mid-shelf coral reefs that are threatened by poor water quality originating from agricultural runoff. There are 35 major river catchments in the GBR World Heritage Area, and 80% of the land is under agriculture from over 12,000 farmers and graziers. Particularly, the sugarcane farming occupies or dominates the low-lying coastal floodplains and contributes over 78% to the dissolved inorganic nitrogen at the end of catchment. Some of the drivers of this is the excessive use of fertilizers and, of course, land clearing and the destruction of coastal wetlands. Now, this has led to the establishment of the ecologically relevant water quality targets. So these are thresholds, and we've just heard about it in the other presentation. These are thresholds that are necessary to maintain the health and resilience of our coastal and marine ecosystems. And although there has been some progress, it was recognized in the past that purely concentrating on changing farmer practices will not be enough to meet the water quality targets. So at AMCS, we were wondering, what can wetlands do, or can wetland restoration be part of the solution to improve water quality in GBR reef catchments? And in 2022, we gathered a group of stakeholders from government, research, NRMs, and conservation organizations to evaluate the effectiveness of coastal wetland restoration as means to meet water quality targets. And the main goal of this document, of the report that came out of this exercise, was to justify further investment by Australian and Queensland governments into wetland restorations as means to improve water quality. And today I'll just show you one of the key highlights from this report. And let's consider two options. Option number one is more or less business as usual, or concentrating on changing farmer practices. And this has an approximate cost of 768 Australian dollars per kilogram of dissolved inorganic nitrogen removed from the system. When compared to option two, a wetland restoration and or construction, which has an approximate cost of 23 to 40 Australian dollars per kilogram that is removed from the system. Now, obviously, these numbers sound almost too good to be true, and we have to take them with a grain of salt. So wetland restoration and construction has a very high initial investment and maintenance cost. And they need to be very well located and very well designed to to get these outcomes. And the difference between constructed and restored wetlands is that, well, constructed wetlands have a higher initial investment and maintenance cost, but they're really effective in improving water quality. Versus restored wetlands have a somewhat lower initial and maintenance cost, but at the same time they're very good at delivering those multiple benefits both for biodiversity and for our cultural values. So our recommendations for next steps are that the Queensland and Australian governments need to prioritize investing into restoring coastal wetlands as means to meet water quality targets. And this includes the identification or funding effort to improve fine-scale mapping of pollution hotspots. And some of this is obviously underway, but I think particularly we need to improve the fine-scale mapping of nitrogen pollution hotspots, so we can better direct our efforts to where to put those restoration efforts. And it also requires the scaling up of previously successful wetland restoration projects. So overall, we should consider wetland restoration as an essential tool in this toolbox of resilience-based management to improve the resilience of our reef. And let's get back briefly to my little photo story. So after visiting this reef in Arthur Bay in April, when I found many of the corals bleached, I came back to the same spot about 5 months later and took a photo of the exact same coral colony and had completely recovered. And I think that it is a good example of how some of the inshore reefs or coral, particular coral species, have a higher resilience or tolerance to poor water quality, but only if that occurs over a shorter time period and in isolation from other threats. So First Nations peoples have known this for a long time, and we as people who work with the reef are also aware of the very intricate link between land and sea. But I think as a group, we have to do better, or we have a duty to communicate this better to the general public and improve the understanding that the reef is not an isolated island in the ocean, but that there's a strong link between land and sea. And so we need to improve our communication and make sure that people know that our individual and collective actions on land and in the sea have a direct impact on our global climate and on extreme weather events, on water quality in reef catchments. And these are obviously all linked to the health of the reef and the coastal ecosystems. And in that sense, they're also linked to the livability and job security in our coastal communities. So I think one of the things that we should expect from our leaders is that they prioritize management actions that are on a global scale. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions by committing to very ambitious emission reduction targets and phasing out fossil fuels. And at the same time, some of these are at local scale, such as committing to strong actions that improve water quality and boost the health of our reef. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. Great presentation. We've got time for one question.